Welcome back, SPC listeners, and Merry Christmas. This one's coming to you on Christmas Day, so enjoy. You ever wonder what that list everyone talks about around Christmas time is? Well, stay with me to find out in episode 82 of the Student Pilot Cast, making a list and checking it twice. Or never.
Chandler Tower, Cherokee 4121 Tango, so Chandler Air Service. We have Zulu, and we'd like a south departure, please.
What does it say to be an angel? Where does the sun go when it sleeps? Is every star that shines so brightly in the sky another promise I must keep? I should by now. It isn't written.
So this is a fun one and a topic that I'm a little passionate about. Today's episode is another Beyond the Checkride with Kent Shook, and we'll be talking about, you guessed it, checklists. Everyone was taught how important checklists can be, of course, but what happens in the real world beyond the checkride? I really do believe that good checklists and good checklist habits for a pilot can be literal lifesavers. But what makes a good checklist, and how can bad checklists be more dangerous than no checklist at all? Well, one way is to teach a pilot bad checklist habits. But we'll get into some of that here. So without further ado, here's the latest Beyond the Checkride segment with Kent. All right, welcome back, everybody, to another Beyond the Checkride. I'm here again with Kent Shook. Are we doing all right, Kent?
We're doing great. Any
Awesome.
day I can talk about flying is a great day.
Always is. All right, so we're coming back at you with another Beyond the Checkride. What have you got for us today?
We are going to talk about checklists.
Oh, I love this topic.
It's an interesting topic because there are opinions all over the board on this one. You know, some people say, well, I don't need a checklist. Some people say, you must use a checklist. Absolutely, every time. Some people have mnemonics that they like to use in certain situations instead. And, you know, I've got to say I've probably been all of the above at one point or another. But the first time I really started thinking a little more about checklists, and the thing that got me off of being a checklist hater was about 14 years ago, after I had gotten my commercial multi, which, I wasn't planning on ever having a job in aviation at that point. But I figured, if the right thing comes along, I don't want to have to turn it down because I don't have the right ratings for it. So,
plus, more training's never a bad thing.
Absolutely. I love to fly, and, getting more ratings lets you fly more stuff. So, anyway, it only took, I guess it was about a year and a half after I got my commercial multi before I had my first right place, right time situation, and I got to fly right seat in a Hawker. Get a little jet time in the logbook. And that was really cool. It was a great experience. I had to spend a bunch of time with the PIC on the ground beforehand, learning about what I was going to need to do and all that. And then the flight itself was only about an hour. But one of the things that really made an impression on me was the checklists in that airplane. Because I was used to just your standard piston GA checklists. And now, through the lens of hindsight, I can see just how bad piston GA checklists are. And I mean, they're awful. Really, really awful. The FAA says we want everybody to use checklists. And to be honest, of all the people that I have flown with in, the outside of the professional world, let's say, all the people who are recreational GA flyers, I think maybe only 2 or 3 were actually like legitimate religious checklist users. And I think this is why, is our checklists are terrible.
Yeah, it still kind of shocks me, but it's probably because I'm spending so much time in a training environment lately, at flight schools and things like that.
Yep.
But yeah, that's a little shocking. They are really bad. The things I can't stand about most GA checklists, especially if they follow the old POHs, even the new ones, sometimes there's a lot of things in there that are completely useless. And then some things and so it just clutters it up. It makes it more difficult to remember to do them because you're not finding value in them.
Bingo.
You're kind of going through it and you're like, this is just such a waste. And then there maybe some things, and you'll probably talk about this later, but then there's some things that you personally know you really need on the checklist because maybe it's something that you're having trouble remembering with your flows, and you want to make sure you go back and check those, but it's not going to be in a standard GA checklist, So yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, some of these checklists, they're just cluttered. They're full of junk. They've got things. I religiously use them, which means that I use a checklist maybe 60% of the time. And I call that religious usage. And it's not that I'm trying not to. I'm talking about, I try to use one every phase of flight, but I skip a lot of times. And so I feel like I'm doing pretty well if I use it 60% of the time for each phase of flight. I'm always doing my flows, but every once in a while I'll get on the ground, and if I'm in a low wing and I'll realize, ooh, I never turned on the electric fuel pump. I accidentally skipped it. So I know I need them. And so I try to use them all the time, which means I use them about 60% of the time.
So think of an instance recently in which you did not use a checklist, and think about, okay, why didn't you use the checklist?
Well, I want to say in an instance I'm thinking of right now, a few weeks ago, when I realized that I hadn't gone through the checklist. This wasn't the time where I had forgotten to do anything, but I realized, oh man, I didn't do it. And the reason I realized I didn't use it was because, I had somebody there. It was my son. I had my son with me, and I was going, oh man, I should be really making sure I use this checklist as setting an example, basically. And I want to say the reason I didn't use it is because I just forgot. I was busy with something that I was doing. But if I'm honest, maybe it was because I didn't feel like I needed it at that point.
Yep, I can totally see that. And, you just made me think of one of the just most fun flights I ever had, not because it was, something mind-boggling, but just because it was simple. I was up at a grass strip in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, way up north. Was there with a bunch of friends for Labor Day weekend. If they're listening, they know who you are. Hi, guys. Great little fly-in. And, we'll go up there and we'll hop on ATVs and drive around in the woods on old fire trails and stuff like that. And it's just a great time. But this particular day, it was toward the end of the day. We had already, grilled out for lunch and been doing all kinds of random up north stuff. And we were coming out of the woods on the ATVs, approaching the airport, and we stopped at an intersection that was about 2 blocks away from the airport. I mean, that's pretty much across town in that place. But we all kind of looked at the sun, which was getting low in the western sky, and it was like probably a half hour till sunset. And someone said, "What should we do now?" And we all kind of look at the sun, and I go, "Let's go fly." So we all just go over to the airport, and we had just been flying before, and there's nobody around. And at the time there wasn't any cell phone signal. So like you couldn't call flight service for a briefing. There's no internet, this is probably even before ForeFlight existed anyway. But like I said, we'd already been flying, so no pre-flights to do, no flight service to call. It was literally just hop in the plane and go. And so it was just this, calming thing to just jump in the plane and go. And it was just a wonderful flight because there wasn't that much to it. It was just super simple. And, when you go down these checklists, they're just not. They make it as complicated as they can, I feel like. Written by lawyers and all that,
Right.
And
right.
I don't know if they're trying to make it look cool or if they think that if they don't make you check every little thing 5 times that they're going to be open to liability of some sort, or a lot of them are step-by-step instructions on how to fly, and you don't need that. Okay, if you're coming in as a brand new student, maybe you need every item on that 172 checklist, but I would say even a handful of flights in, one of my examples that I love to brag on Cessna about is if you look in a Cessna 172 pre-flight checklist, it says master, on, fuel gauges, check, master, off. Like, really? How about just put fuel gauges, check, and if they say empty and you looked in the wing and it was full of fuel, maybe go, oh, yeah, those are electric gauges. I need to turn the master on for a second. So as a result of things like that, after flying the Hawker, I went back and I
don't mean to interrupt, Kent, but I got to ask, and how many times do I need to check that the trim is set for takeoff?
18. But no, after flying the Hawker, I went back and I looked at, the checklists are all a little different. I feel like there were more checklists before takeoff in the Hawker, but they were all just like half a dozen killer items, and that's it. Yep. And so I went back and looked, and if you count up all the checklist items that you have before the wheels leave the ground, there's more of them for a Cessna 172 than there are for a Hawker 800 jet.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's utterly stupid. So FAA, if you're listening, that's why people don't use checklists when you're not looking.
Yeah.
And of course, that's a detriment to safety. There are important things on those checklists. And so
I'm going to ask you a question, Kent, just to make sure you clarify. When you say killer items, I don't think you mean, oh, these are really cool items. So do you want to explain that a little bit?
I mean things that will literally kill you, and or
right on.
Things that might damage the airplane.
Right. Right.
Going back through the POH on my airplane, which it's a good thing to do now and then. I've had this airplane for 12 years, and there's a lot of stuff in there that made me go, okay. One of the things that they put in there that I maybe should check better than I do is to make sure that the gear switch is down before the master goes on. Because my gear's electric.
Oh, yeah.
If that gear switch is up, I don't know if the motor's strong enough to pull the wheels in.
But it's not going to be good for it. Yeah.
No, it's definitely not going to be good for it. So, yeah, I'm either going to burn out a motor and pop a breaker, or I'm going to drop the airplane on the ground. Now, I've probably gotten complacent about that because there are 2 people who fly my airplane. And so we're also both very similar in how we approach flying and such. And so I am able to trust that my co-owner in the airplane is not going to leave the gear switch up. But let's say, there was just an event at an airport near here last week. Hello to everyone in the only Wanakee in the world. They have a great pancake breakfast and like airport community day there. And so they have all kinds of kids who are wanting to sit in airplanes and stuff. And, we used to always take the club airplanes over there and let the kids crawl around and all that. Well, okay, after something like that, Well, yeah, you'd best be sure all the switches are where you want them to be before you do anything. Anyway, so now that we have spent almost 15 minutes talking about how bad checklists are, let's kind of move on to how can we make them better. And I do want to talk about a couple of things that make them easier to use eventually, once you get past the setup phase. Our friends at ForeFlight have checklists in their product. You can have ForeFlight read you your checklists, which it just does at whatever pace you set. But I got to admit that what inspired me to dive back into checklists here is a new product, relatively new product anyway, called Goose, which is billed as your AI Copilot. They were at Oshkosh this year. They sponsored an entire exhibit hangar. And I got to admit, that's the first time I've ever seen an exhibit hangar sponsored by a company I've never heard of before.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But
Very
they had
interesting product.
Yeah. So they had their, they got the booth right inside the door for sponsoring the hangar. And, I went over there and checked it out, and it's pretty darn cool. You can set your checklists up in there, among other things. It actually does more than just checklists, but you can set it up so that it will wait for you. This is kind of the default, I think, where it will read you a checklist item, and then you say either check or skip, or you can even say go back, and it'll go back to the previous one and that sort of thing. But it, just by doing actual voice response, I feel like it has a kind of a new dimension over some of the other app-based checklist products. And it does also have...
It can alert you that it's time to run a checklist at certain phases of flights, during certain phases of flight as well, which is pretty interesting for not forgetting or moving over a checklist.
Yeah. And that part I haven't completely gotten into yet. I know that it can set timers, for example. So maybe at the end of your before takeoff checklist, we'll start a timer for a minute or two and then say, hey, do you want to do your after takeoff checklist now? And that sort of thing. I don't know if it lets you do stuff based on climb and descent and all that sort of thing, but
it does it. It can. I don't know if it has that feature yet. I haven't dived in enough, but it does do it based on distance from your destination.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. So as you're approaching your airport, maybe you have it set to remind you to do your pre-landing checklist when you're 10 miles out, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, though that's a reason that maybe some other people want to get back into checklists as well and think about how their checklists are built. I think that checklists are something that are at least somewhat unique to an individual, or that they should be. They are written for airplanes, but there are probably some things that, maybe you're more prone to forgetting than I am, or vice versa. And so, the first time I forget something, well, it needs to go on a checklist, right?
Yep.
So how do we build checklists? I'm going to say that we mentioned the difference between the Hawker and the 172. I'm going to give you a before and after so far for my checklist project on the Mooney. Again, up to the point where the wheels leave the ground, the POH has 173 checklist items. Kind of a lot, right?
Yeah, that's a lot.
After, I've got it down to 74. And that does, both of those do include the entire pre-flight inspection. So,
right.
But for example, factory checklist has 74 items on the pre-flight. Mine has 34. Their before start checklist has 26 items. Mine has 8. I actually will be adding more to this after I finish going through everything on the factory checklist and thinking through it. But given those numbers,
You'll be adding those personal items, the things that you
yes.
that you need. Yep.
Yeah, and really the main thing there is one of the categories I actually wanted to talk about, which is procedural items. So all these checklists that were written by lawyers, as we like to say, they have everything you need to know about the airplane, and they don't cover anything else.
Yep.
So, for example, well, like the Mooney does talk about the radios being set. That's kind of an old checklist, right?
Yep.
Really, we ought to be talking about the flight plan being entered into the GPS these days, as well as the radios being set. But, when you're making an IFR flight, there are additional procedural things that you need to make sure that you do that, they're not going to kill you on a VFR flight, but they might kill you on an IFR flight. Might be able to get away with it without a takeoff briefing on a VFR flight. But if you blast off into the clouds and go, oh, wait, what was my obstacle departure procedure again?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you might be in the side of a mountain before you are able to go back and fix that. So that sort of thing I've found
Really
is
good point.
rarely on GA checklists. And as a result, I'm sitting here talking about there being too much on the checklists most of the time. That's true of the normal checklists. I found the opposite is true of the emergency checklists. Some airplanes, when you look at the emergency checklist for engine failure in a single, for example, they start talking about setting the mixture to rich and switching fuel tanks and, going to a different mag or whatever. And the first thing ought to be airspeed.
Pitch.
Get your
Pitch
best
for
glide
best glide,
airspeed.
yes.
Yes. The second thing should be find where you're going to land and turn that way.
Exactly. Totally agree.
Then start looking at the airplane.
And by the way, I want to add, especially for new pilots, if you haven't thought about this, pitch for best glide is almost always going to be a pull unless you happen to be on takeoff.
Yeah, unless you're climbing.
Yep. And you might as well, if you're in cruise and you're starting to lose your engine, you might as well take that altitude when you can get it. So
yeah. And of course, trim for it right away, or you're not going to be keeping it for very long.
Yep. Good point.
One hint I've heard is that most airplanes, it's pretty close to all the way nose up trim.
Yep. Most GA piston airplanes, it'll be almost all the way back.
So yeah, there are definitely some opportunities to flesh some things out, and especially on emergency checklists, you're already going to have a startle fight or flight kind of response going on. And so you absolutely do not want to skip something important. And that's why you really do need to kind of add things to the emergency checklist, even if they might seem fairly obvious. You don't want to make the checklist ridiculously long, but you do want to be sure that those things that were just talked about, that aren't necessarily related to airplane systems are taken care of, because generally those are the most important. So let's see. I guess my overall method for doing this is to start with the factory checklist. Don't just start from scratch.
Yeah, there could be some things on there that are killer items, and you want to make sure that those make it
the
on.
factory checklists are written how they are for reasons. I think that there are some better reasons sometimes to change how they work. One thing that I have done quite a bit of to get my item count down is just to combine things that are right next to each other, for example. At one point, I think my checklist says to turn the master on, and then it says to turn the alternator field on, and then it says avionics master, and it's doing things that are right next to each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say masters 3 on. That makes sure that I covered all 3 of them, but it makes it so that I only have one checklist item, and they're all right next to each other. So it's not like I have to look around for anything to know that item is complete.
Yeah.
Same thing. I have 3 items for seats, seat belts, and shoulder harnesses. Well, I go back to the checklists that we used in the TBM. Seats, adjusted and belted. Done.
Yep.
You
Yep.
covered all 3 of those things in a single item.
Yep.
Another one that
going back to how bad these checklists can be, that's one of my pet peeves when there's a bunch of things. The seats, seat belts, shoulder harnesses, I cannot stand that on a checklist, especially when they're all, separate items. These are why we skip things, because there's too many, and you're looking down, you're glancing, and you're going, yeah. I know these all 3 are together. You're moving down, and then you may skip one that's actually a killer item that's after those, because there's just too many. And I know we're harping on that, but I love where you're going with this, because if we made these checklists more useful, we would use them more and use them more effectively. So I love this. Yeah, perfect example.
And some people might think, oh, well, going and making your own checklists isn't safe. Well, I disagree. A, it makes you think about everything. B, it makes it more likely that you're actually going to use your checklists. And if you're using paper checklists, I mean, those 172 checklists are tiny print because there's a billion different things on them. Well, when I first started making my own checklists, I did it with some help from my CFII, and I was able to, format everything myself. And I got the whole thing basically onto 2 sides of a single sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper. And things were printed probably double the size that they are in a 172 POH. So it makes it less likely that you'll miss individual items as well.
Yeah, for the planes I fly, I try to get them on both sides of a half sheet, and then I laminate them when I'm using paper checklists. They might not be as large as yours were, but they're large enough for me to read, because I've got old eyes these days. But the other reason not to use a checklist is it's hard to handle in the cockpit. I'll give you an example. A lot of times people will use these checklists that are like trifold, checklists, so they fit in the pocket or whatever. But then you're like turning pages basically and trying to find the right spot on the checklist. I want something, if I'm using a kneeboard, I want something I can stash somewhere and pull out, hold it up, and use it without having to fumble around with 2 hands. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so those kinds of things drive me nuts too. So just to add like kind of the physical, I know that we were talking a little earlier about using electronic checklists. We talked about Goose. We talked about ForeFlight. There's others also. And I've started experimenting with using more electronic checklists to see how that fits into my flows and see how that fits into the way that I'm flying. I think the dimension of having Goose talk to you could be a really good way to go. But however you do it, that's not really what we're focusing on here. It's not really the important thing. The important thing is what's on the checklist so that we're using it, and is it easy to use, whatever it may be. If it's
absolutely
laminated card, or if it's an electronic, whatever it is, it has to be easy for you to use, so you'll use it.
Yeah. And what I did when I was first doing my edited checklists on paper was I'd print it on one side. I would have one sheet, a full 8.5 by 11, that I would fold in half.
Yes.
And put into the IFR flight file thing that you could buy from Sporties that held paper approach plates back when we used those too.
Yep.
So it was effectively a half sheet both sides for all my normal procedures, and another half sheet both sides for all the emergency procedures.
Love it.
Worked great. I was showing you the TBM checklists we were using before earlier, and those were printed on half sheets, laminated, and then one hole punched in the corner, and we just have a little binder ring. And so all the checklists were just in a little packet on this ring, and we just slap them right in between the glare shield and the A-pillar. So they were always right there.
Yep.
Made it super easy. And then, as we kind of went through the flight, you'd just page through the checklists and you were always right there ready for the next one.
Yeah.
So there's a million ways to use them and to format them. And, when I finish this process, I probably will put them in Goose and ForeFlight and on my Garmin 750 and print them out.
Yes. I was just going to say, when you were talking about stashing them on the A-pillar, mine, and basically any airplane I'm flying, is being stashed between, the glare shield and the windscreen, and off to the right, because I'm flying right seat now all the time, so it's always off to the right there. Always easy for me to grab. That's the thing I'm scared about the most if I transition to electronic. But like you, I've started thinking, well, why not just have a paper one too? And I'll just have it stashed where I always know what it's at, and I can always pull that out and use it no matter what, if I don't want to take the extra, couple seconds to get to it on whatever device I've got it on.
And it is worth saying, we're pilots. We like to have backups for everything, right?
True.
Same goes
for
checklists.
Yeah.
Paper checklists blow out the window, so they're not the only thing that, I'm sure there are some people who would be like, you should use paper, but yes, you should have a backup for everything, even your paper.
I know we're going long, but I have to tell this story because of what you just said. So when I started a few months back, when I started my transition training to the right seat, my very first flight in the right seat, you'll never guess what happened. I was flying a Piper, so low wing, it was an Archer. And it's hot, it's middle of the summer, so we always start the airplane with the doors open and the window open and everything. And one thing I'd never had to deal with was the checklist flying out the door. And what happened the very first time I flew from the right seat, I started the engine with the checklist on my lap.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So yeah, I got that engine started, I think the checklist just flew out. And so I had to shut down, get it unstrapped, move the seat back, get out of the airplane, go find it. It had blown under another airplane, about 30 yards behind, and grab it, bring it back to the airplane, and start the procedure all over again. So I had to say that, yes, they sometimes blow out the window. Sometimes your iPad loses its battery or overheats, whatever. So yes, backups are a good idea. I agree.
Excellent. Well, let's kind of continue with how we build these things. Like I said, we're going to start with factory checklists and literally go through every item and say, okay, why is this here? Should it be somewhere else? Should it be here at all? Should it be combined with something else? So, I don't know if we're going to actually use video here, but let me share my other screen with you here. So on the left is my factory POH. On the right is my personal checklist. And I basically am writing up this whole document with what I am doing and taking notes and all that. So let me start here with my before start checklist. Basically, I've color-coded things here. So if something is still black, it's as it is from the factory. If it's red, it means I eliminated it. If it's orange, it means I have moved it somewhere else. And if it's green, it means I moved it from somewhere else. And then if it's something that I just added, it's blue. So if you look at this, you can see there's not a whole lot of black here.
Right.
Like, for example, right here is that masters thing. So they said master off, alternator off, avionics master off. And I just changed that to masters off, or masters 3 off, rather. That's a little unclear just because of how I formatted it right there. But this is just notes. This is not my actual checklist. I'm going to enter this into Goose and all the other places, but this is just me keeping track of what I'm doing in terms of what's different from the factory checklist. So now you can see, okay, right below that, alternator and avionics master have been moved away because they're combined into masters. And then fuel boost pump switches off. Well, I looked at that and went, okay, there's not a real good reason why they would ever be on at this point anyway. And if they are on, what happens? What's the negative effect? I turn the master on, I hear the pump, I go, well, that's weird. I turn the pump off. It's not going to hurt the airplane. It's not going to hurt me. Get rid of it. Next thing, directional gyro, slave. Okay, slave to HSI. We never take that thing out of slaving mode. And if we had to, it would probably be going to the avionics shop. So that one, okay, well, I'm going to take care of that in the instrument checks. So instead of instruments check or something like that later on, like during taxi, I'm going to say, okay, HSI, slaved, moving, matching the compass. You can see a lot of these are moved to interior pre-flight because, I was thinking about these in terms of if I'm going flying on a summer day, do I need to be doing this sitting in the cockpit sweating, or can I do it on a pre-flight inspection, before my passengers show up and all that kind of stuff? So you'll see there's some things I moved to the interior pre-flight. There's some things I moved to the engine start checklist. There's some things that rocker switches all off. Again, what's the consequence here? I want to leave my elevator trim switch on all the time unless I have a runaway trim scenario, because I've had to replace that switch and it was $325. So there is no reason to be switching that on and off every time when that is an item that pretty much is always going to be on. Boost pump we talked about. Pitot heat, I will have checked on the pre-flight elsewhere. Really, there's no reason for me to go through and turn all those off. They're either already off or they have no effect anyway. So got rid of that. Flaps up. Again, this is before start. The only consequential thing with the flaps is that I get them into the takeoff position prior to takeoff. So
put them on the pre-takeoff checklist.
Exactly. And they were already there, which is, that's one reason why there were 173 items before liftoff. Because, for example, I'll have to go and find the pre-takeoff checklists here. Here we go.
Are the lawyers, back when that POH was printed, are they afraid that you might get a stiff wind, and if the flaps are down, you might take off while you're taxing? I mean, seriously,
I don't know.
What are they worried about?
There's a lot of stuff that just makes no sense. But if you look on the left side of the screen, about halfway down here is where their before takeoff checklist starts. And if you go through and pass all these notes and everything, and then they have this takeoff checklist, they're basically having you recheck almost everything on your before takeoff checklist. So yeah, unless it's going to kill you, there's no reason to check it more than once.
Yep.
So anyway, the other thing that we want to get rid of is what I'm calling how to fly items and do list items. So there's a few more of those later on, but if we look at engine start checklist, I think has some. They say low boost on. Well, that depends on the type of start. If it's a flooded start or a hot start, you're not doing that. So pretty much I have prop clear and engine start there after a few other things. But, if you look up
the
here,
how to fly thing,
throttle,
I got to tell
prop, mixture, master. How about power levers set for start? Done. Engine prime, that covers all the boost pump and power levers and all that as well, and lets you edit in your head what's going on, because let's say I'm doing a hot start. Well, this is all different. Mooney put it all in a separate checklist, but that checklist doesn't have all the items on it. So you actually have to do both checklists, and then you're skipping items on one. And that's just not a good practice anyway. So that it just makes no sense at all. So any of that list stuff we get rid of.
Yep. I got to say, when you said the how to fly stuff, it kind of cracked me up a little bit, because while I've been experimenting with these electronic checklists, I'm bringing in these default checklists in ForeFlight that come from the POHs. And I pulled one in. I don't even remember which one it was, maybe for a 172. And it had a takeoff checklist, and it had things on it like full power, rotate at 60, and I'm just dying. Like, are you kidding me? Like, if you're using a checklist while you're on the takeoff roll, you're in serious trouble.
Yes.
So, yeah. So crazy.
Right there on the left-hand side of my screen again, takeoff, power full throttle, annunciators check, engine instruments, check for proper indications, liftoff climb speed as specified in section 5, landing gear, retract and climb, wing flaps up. Like, what are you doing?
This is not a good checklist. Yes.
This is a terrible checklist.
That is a how-to, not a
Yes.
checklist.
Now, I want you to take note of one thing here. The factory checklist jumps straight from before takeoff to climb. And if you look over on the right-hand side, you can see I have an entire checklist here that I've added. Actually, it wasn't even that one. I might have two now that I look at it. Yeah, I haven't colored this yet. So I have an after start checklist that is separate from the before taxi checklist.
Right.
I also have an after takeoff checklist. Now, on a small GA airplane, after takeoff and climb could be combined. And that's, the factory checklist has a climb checklist. It's missing a bunch of stuff in my opinion, but it's there. But the reason for after start is that these are a few things that really ought to be done right away after the engine is started, rather than starting the engine and then kind of getting distracted with putting the flight plan into the GPS and talking to your passengers about what's happening next and this and that and the other things. So
I feel the same way, Kent. And so some of the checklists I've used have an after start. What I did when I was making my own checklist is I made the engine start checklist include those items after starting the engine. So yeah, same thing. Just make sure you finish a checklist or do that next checklist before you move on to other things. Because yes, there are things that you want to do right after the engine starts. Totally agree.
Definitely. So yeah, stuff like checking to make sure you have oil pressure, your alternators on and charging, your mixture's leaned so you're not fouling your spark plugs, all that sort of stuff. That should be done immediately after the engine is started, because, if you don't have oil pressure, you got to get that thing shut down before you damage it. And then you can get into all of the other stuff, really kind of getting ready for the flight. And then when you're ready to taxi, or you feel like you're ready to taxi, then you do the before taxi checklist. So,
yep, totally agree.
And then stuff for takeoff here. Again.
And I want to point something out that we touched on earlier, and you'll probably talk about later. But this is a really good example, so I don't want to give up the opportunity. For me, I like to, instead of having an extra checklist, I like to add those items on to the engine start checklist. Kent may want to have a separate checklist that he does right away called the after takeoff, or I'm sorry, the after engine start checklist. This is what we were talking about before when we said that it's really good to create these for yourself, because we may have different standard operating procedures. We may think about things slightly differently. And I don't mean just Kent and myself, but every one of us as pilots. And so make these checklists match how it's going to work effectively for you, because they're for you. So I just wanted to point that out, that we may all do these things a little bit differently, and that's totally fine. make it work for you.
Yeah. One thing to note on that, though, is that if you're looking toward a career in aviation,
Good point.
you're not going to be able to make your own checklists in a Boeing 737 at Southwest Airlines. Those will be made for you. And, we'll probably talk about standard operating procedures at some point, but any reasonably sized carrier, whether it's 135 or 121, is going to have standard operating procedures so that, you can hop in a cockpit with
Everybody does it the same way. Yep.
And right. Everybody does it the same way and everybody's on the same page. That's a huge, huge boon to safety for everybody to be doing it the same way.
That is an excellent call out. Yep. What I was referring to was for GA, but that is an excellent call out. Yep.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll be in a situation where there's an SOP and that's what you'll be following. Yep.
Right. What I want to say is I'm not disagreeing with you here. However, in the case that you have, let's say, a place that you want to work and you can get checklists from them, if you have a friend that flies there or something like that, see what they have. Because one thing, we kind of talked about Goose automatically alerting you before, but if you can get into good habits right away anyway, and think about, okay, it's after takeoff, I have a checklist to run, or I'm climbing through 10,000 feet, I have a checklist to run. All that sort of thing, that can really be helpful to you later on. And, that's another reason I had started looking at this a few years ago too. Last time I kind of went through this process was, okay, I'm flying a Mooney on my own. I'm flying a TBM in a professional crew environment. I want to make those two things as similar to each other as I can so that they're reinforcing good habits in both directions. So,
excellent point.
If that is your situation, it's worth trying to, pattern things similarly, just so that you get into good habits right off the bat. I realize that's going to be pretty difficult for a lot of people because, you may not know where you're going to go eventually, where you want to go yet. But if you're in a situation where you have that luxury, or if you're already doing some professional flying as well as some GA flying, it's worth trying to make those things as similar as you can make them.
Yep.
So, all that said, it's worth moving things around a little bit. I have seen some checklists where if you follow the order that's on the checklist, it just has you bouncing all over the place. Really good checklists will follow a flow, and you can do the flow before you do the checklist. In the TBM, we called it the inverted C because we basically went across the overhead panel, down the middle, and then back to the left. Kind of made things real easy. If you have to jump all over the place, it's going to slow you down. And checklists taking longer is one reason why some people don't use them. So, we're basically trying to take away all those barriers to people using checklists. So make them make sense. Think about why something might have been put in a particular place and why it's there and how moving might affect other checklist items. But in a lot of cases, you're going to find, okay, well, there's really no reason not to move this item in between these other two so that I can just kind of check things off in an order that makes more sense. An example of that for the Mooney is, like many airplanes, the pre-flight checklist has you starting at a particular point on the airplane and then going around the whole airplane. Well, that's a do list.
Yep.
So what I did when I made it into a checklist is I kind of did it so it was tail forward. I'm not putting separate items in for right wing and left wing and all that stuff. So, for example, I have a static port on both sides of the airplane. I need to check both static ports, but I don't need two separate checklist items for that. Static ports,
Right.
two checked,
Right.
done. So I just kind of went tail to nose. Makes sense with the way my airplane is in the hangar and how I would go back and check something if I had missed it. So I think we mentioned this already, but anytime you forget something on a flight, that's probably worth adding to your checklist, even if it only happens once.
Yep.
We talked about some IFR specific stuff.
I've got a question for you, Kent. Going back to that to-do list for a pre-flight checklist, and obviously I spend some time flying in a flight school environment, and once I can get a DPE to do my check ride, I'll probably be spending more time flying in a flight, in a learning environment. I've been kicking around the idea, and I'm just sort of running this by you to see what you think. We haven't talked about this before, but I've been kicking around the idea of having a separate sheet of paper that is a pre-flight, interior and exterior to-do list that my students could learn how to do it with. But I love the idea of not having that stuff in order on the checklist like you were just talking about. It's one of the biggest checklists there is. One of the biggest sections of the checklist is the pre-flight.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of things to hit. And it's the one part of even my checklist that I feel like are to-do lists. And we want to stay away from to-do lists on a checklist, right? I find myself not really using it. I carry it around with me when I'm doing the pre-flight, but I've got a flow for the pre-flight. And then afterwards, I kind of run my finger down very quickly just to try and make sure I didn't miss anything. But doing that's very difficult when there's so many items. So I'm kicking around this idea of having a separate sheet. It's not part of the checklist. That's a to-do list for a pre-flight. Having them kind of learn with that and then check the most critical items on the checklist when they're done to make sure that those things got done. And then pretty soon they won't even need that to-do list,
Right.
What do you think of that idea?
I think it's a great idea. And, like we've already said, checklists can be different for different people. And let's expand on that to say checklists can be different for the same person at different times in their flying career. It is 100% appropriate for somebody to have a checklist for pre-flight that has every single thing on it in order as you go around the entire airplane and repeats stuff from the left wing on the right wing and, all that sort of thing. Because they're going to need that initially. After a certain number of flights and they have that down, well, maybe they can move on to something that's more of a check the box and yes, I checked all those things in all of the places they exist on the airplane without having to do it all in order.
Exactly.
And you know what?
Exactly.
Maybe if that person doesn't fly for a while, they go back to the lengthy procedure in the POH
to-do
again.
list. Yep.
And, a lot of this, especially in something like a 172 that's designed as a trainer, that's why they have all these how to fly items and the do list items and all that, because it really is kind of an instruction manual for how to fly an airplane in general. But you don't need that forever. So I think, student pilots, for the most part, could probably go with just what's in the book. And then maybe once they have their private and they're starting to work on their instrument, that's when they kind of knock off some of those things that are feeling obvious to them at that point. Again, as long as it's not a killer item.
Some of those
then add
items,
in some of those things that are IFR procedural items as they move into their instrument training.
Yeah, but some of those items I don't think belong on a checklist even for a brand new student, because you're not going to be using a checklist like that, right? So
yeah.
So, these are things that they should study and that they should get familiar with and practice. And again, maybe have a separate sheet. It's like a cheat sheet, like, okay, this is what a takeoff looks like or whatever it may be. But it probably still doesn't rotate at 55 knots. That doesn't belong on a checklist ever. You're never going to be looking at a checklist when you rotate. So,
yeah, if that belongs on a checklist, it belongs on the before takeoff
briefing,
checklist as part of your takeoff briefing. Right.
Exactly. Yep. All right. We're on the same page. So yeah, something I've been thinking about lately. So wanted to run it by you.
Yeah. That's kind of my last bit, is to add, good practice procedures like takeoff briefing. I don't think I've ever actually seen that on an airline or an airplane checklist, but what are you going to do if your engine fails? So that's something that even in the TBM, it may be a fancy turbine airplane, but it's still a single. And so I would always brief, okay, which way am I turning if I'm high enough to try and turn back to the airport?
Yep.
Which way is the wind coming from? Where are the roadways and fields and stuff? I would actually zoom in on the satellite view in ForeFlight and look around the airport a little bit and go, okay, it's all trees to the left, but there's a highway over to the right that we can make it to if we're above, 400 feet off the ground or something like that. Adding things in like that is great. One of the nice features Goose has is it lets you put tags on checklist items and filter them. So if something is only relevant to an IFR flight, you can actually filter out all the IFR items when you go on a VFR flight. We could probably have a discussion over whether that's actually a good idea or not.
Right. That is an interesting concept.
In the TBM, we always kept the checklists exactly the same, but we actually did have separate checklists for night currency when we were just going to be staying in the pattern, because so many items on the regular checklist were irrelevant on a flight like that. It was completely different than an operational flight would be. But certain things are still different on a quick, short VFR repositioning flight that's Part 91 compared to, okay, now we're going somewhere with a plane full of passengers, Part 135. So,
right.
Whether you say irrelevant or you just use a feature in the software to skip over it, doesn't really matter, but something to think about as well.
Yeah, there is something to be said. Always doing it the same way, right?
Yep.
Excellent.
Well, I think we've pretty much beat this one to death, huh?
For sure. Yeah, this is good stuff. This is really good stuff.
It's time to run the podcast shutdown checklist.
All right, let me pull that out here. Yeah, so that is good stuff. And I think this is a really good segue into checklist for somebody who's just beyond the Checkride, because you've been flying with somebody else's checklist, most likely. You've been flying with a flight school or an instructor's checklist, and you're going to start flying on your own. It's good to be thinking about these things and thinking, how am I going to be able to try and do this the same way every time and use these checklists to keep myself safe, get these killer items completed. And so, Kent, I really appreciate you covering this topic so well, especially because you've got a lot of even recent personal experience going through your Mooney checklist. And then, of course, your professional flying experience is really helpful as well. So really appreciate you doing this. Any last ideas or concepts on checklists before we kill it?
Well, I was going to say that there may be some DPEs out there who are not okay with you using checklists you made yourself. If they're good, I would hope that you could still have a discussion with them and say, here's how I made the checklists. And I started with the factory checklist. I've added things on.
I've combined items. Yeah.
Right. And, for what it's worth, the checklists that we used flying the TBMs are not the factory checklists. They are checklists that we made that the FAA then approved. And I think they may have had to have all of the items from the factory checklists in them, but we definitely added a bunch of our own procedures as well.
And maybe moved them around a little bit to match your SOP and all
so
that.
There's at least a little bit of precedent within the FAA for not using factory checklists, because they do approve operators checklists as well. So hopefully you can have a discussion with an examiner and say, hey, look, yes, this is not the factory checklist. However, this is how I did it, and this is how I covered all the bases, and hopefully they'll be cool with that. that's not a conversation that I would start. But if
Right.
they asked about the checklists I was using, I would hope that they would still let you use those. But
And when you're
on the
flying
off chance,
somebody else's airplane, you might want to check with them too to make sure that they're okay with the checklist you're using, just to make sure that it is covering all the things that's going to protect the airplane itself. But and that would include, the reason I bring that up is that would include, for instance, a flight school. So while I did make my own checklist while I've been in all the flight schools I've been in, I made sure to include all the items they had on theirs. I would just kind of rearrange or reorganize or combine. But I did that out of respect for, hey, these are your airplanes. I'm going to make sure that all of these things are on here.
Yeah.
Your standard operating procedures, I'm going to follow what you want us to do. When you're flying for yourself, even in a club or you own your own airplane or anything like that, you have a little bit more leeway. So,
yeah. And, for what it's worth, I created checklists for the Diamond Star when the club purchased it. And it was mostly just taking the POH checklist and adding the 8 airplane flight manual supplements for various equipment that was installed on it and combining them all, because that's something that is easily forgotten. If you don't go and check, okay, how many AFMSs are in the actual physical POH for this airplane, those are important too.
Yeah, good point. All right. Well, thanks again, Kent. Great topic. I'm sure that listeners and viewers will have lots of their own opinions. So let's hear them. You can always reach out to us, and you can reach me at bill@studentpilotcast.com and a bunch of other ways as well on social media. So definitely reach out, comment, whatever you need to do, get it off your chest. We want to hear it. We love to hear feedback, and we love to hear ideas from other pilots. So bring it. So Kent, until next time, thanks again. We'll talk to you later.
All right. We'll see you.
Well, thanks for hanging out with us for this Beyond the Checkride episode, and we hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure some of you are fired up about the topic and have some opinions of your own, so please reach out and let us know your thoughts. You can reach us via email at bill@studentpilotcast.com or via the contact page on the website. You can also reach out via X using @BillWill. That's Bravo India Lima Lima, Whiskey India Lima. And we do have a newish Instagram account for the podcast called, appropriately, Student Pilotcast. So feel free to contact us there if you want to. That said, I want everyone to have a Merry Christmas and a great New Year. And keep the dirty side down by using good checklists and using them well. So we'll catch you on the next one.